and Learning Center. I'm here today with my colleagues Betty Craig and Kathy Shulkin. Do quick introductions. Betty Craig is a professional development associate with the center. She has a broad range of experience as a teacher, an instructional coach, a district administrator, as well as a national consultant and presenter. Her passion remains the improvement of student learning through providing teachers and schools with relevant and supportive professional development. She served in all sorts of capacities, everything from, as I said, classroom teacher through director of professional development for a district in the Tucson, Arizona area. And currently she is conducting professional development with us across the country with K-12 teachers, administrators, and schools and school districts, and looks at this as an opportunity to continue her teaching. My colleague Kathy Shulkin is the Senior Director of Marketing with Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, the Leadership and Learning Center, and I've had the pleasure and privilege of working with Kathy for going on 11 years now, and she will be helping facilitate our meeting today by fielding your questions and letting us know when you all have questions that you would like for us to respond to. Kathy would also be a great contact person for any follow-up information, as well as Betty and myself. And a little bit about me. I'm formerly an administrator in Norfolk Public Schools, Norfolk, Virginia, and have had the privilege of working with the Leadership and Learning Center for going on 11 years at this point. And work across the country, as Betty does, with school systems all over the United States, K-12 administrators, teachers, and central office personnel. I'd like to welcome you to our session today, The Impact of Feedback on Achievement in the Common Core, subtitled Learning How to Provide Feedback That Matters. This is, we're finding, folks, an incredibly important and timely topic, as many of us here today are in the throes of the transition to the Common Core. My colleagues and I work daily with schools and school systems all across the country and see the challenges that they face, not only in moving to new standards, but also in adjusting their curriculum and instruction to the higher level of rigor represented in those standards. The Fordham Foundation recently compared all 50 states' standards to the Common Core and found that all but 2 states were facing a huge jump in rigor. Additionally, many of us serve students that already have sometimes large deficits. So the question becomes, how do we close this potentially widening gap? And one very powerful answer for that is feedback. So a couple of quick housekeeping notes here. Already, I believe most of you are logged into the audio by dialing into the number on your screen. You may choose to either be connected through voice over internet protocol through your computer, or if you'd like to use the telephone, please dial the number that you see there, area code 646, and enter the access code that you see on the screen. That will also be running along the bottom of your presentation. If for whatever reason you should get kicked off, you'll see those numbers there at the bottom. We'll leave that up just for a second to give folks an opportunity to dial in if they need to. Some protocols. If you have questions throughout this webinar, we certainly encourage those. Please send them in. Don't wait to the end. Don't wait to email us after it's over. Please ask your questions as they occur to you. We'd like to ask you to use the question function on your screen to send those in, and as I mentioned, Kathy Shulkin will let us know that we have those. In order to limit the outside interruptions, we have this set up as one-way audio, so please do not ask questions orally because we cannot hear you. If you have private questions, please send those either to myself, and you see my address there, and you'll see that again at the end, but tflach@leadandlearn.com. or Betty Craig at bcraig@leadandlearn.com. Or you may certainly call our Denver office, area code 303-504-9312, and just ask for the operator, let her know what your question is, and she will be glad to direct you to the appropriate person. We have a question already.
We do. We have a number of them, and we're just going to do this quickly so that we can move on, but I don't want to proceed without responding to Dave's question of which 2 states are more stringent than the Common Core.
Wonderful question, Dave. And if you'd like more information, you can certainly check out the Fordham's website or send me an email, and I can send you the synopsis of the study. The 2 states that were rated as being close to the Common Core standards but not exceeding were California and Massachusetts. And Fordham used a kind of a ABCD scale and found that California and Massachusetts were both B's, B pluses, I believe, if I recall the study correctly. Everyone else was at best a B minus or a C. So we had some really significant gaps between the current state standards and what's represented in the new Common Core. All right. Again, folks, please keep sending those questions in. Give you a quick heads up of some opportunities to extend your learning. If after today's webinar you'd like to learn more about visible learning, we have the Visible Learning's Foundation seminar that we'll be hosting in Las Vegas. Now, you know what they say is that what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, but we certainly hope that you bring your learning back to your school and school system and implement what you've learned there. And that will be with my colleague Ainsley Rose. We also have a Visible Learning Institute. It is a one-day institute in Phoenix, Arizona on December 14th. You'll have the opportunity there to see John Hattie, the author of the books Visible Learning and Visible Learning for Teachers, as well as our colleague Raymond Smith. And of course, we strongly recommend that you have permanent resources available. And the two books that you see pictured on the screen here are absolutely terrific go-to resources for your reference as you engage in this work in your school and your school system. Absolutely indispensable. We strongly recommend that you get these books. And finally, if you'd like to learn more about the constructive use of data or effective teacher collaboration around data, we will be hosting the Data Team Summit December 5th and 6th, where I will be joined by my colleagues Laura Besser, Angela Perry, Steve Ventura, and Barb Pitchford. And regardless of where you are in the process of collaboration around data, whether you are looking to begin the process or refine your current practices, my colleagues and I will share key learnings and insights from over a decade of work in the field to help you move your practices along. So we're going to do a quick poll here, folks, kind of as a pre-assessment as we get going, because our session today is about feedback and about specifically using feedback to help us meet and exceed the challenges represented in the Common Core. In order to begin that work, we have to not only understand what our own definition of feedback might be, as well as understand what our colleagues feel feedback would be defined as. And so we're going to do a fast poll here. We're going to ask that you choose one or more. Choose one, I apologize, and you see the poll open on your screen there. Give you about 30 seconds or so to respond to that, and then we'll display the data from the response. Our question is, how do you currently define feedback? All right, so ladies and gentlemen, you can see the vast majority of us have responded that feedback is information passed from teacher to student. And certainly that is one of the definitions of feedback that John Hattie uses in his work. But what's important, folks, is that we also really need to define feedback as all of these things. In fact, as you look at answer choice B there, information passed from student to student, some of the research that we're going to be talking about today comes from Graham Nuthall, who did an absolutely astounding study. He actually went into classrooms and schools and put microphones on students during the school day and tape recorded all of the conversations in which they were engaged and then transcripted those at the end of each day. What he found was that it was as much as 80% of the feedback that students receive actually comes from other students. And in addition to that, what he found was that 80% of that feedback was wrong. Certainly we want feedback going from administrators to teachers and from students to teachers. In fact, descriptor D there, or answer choice D there, folks, is actually the definition of formative assessment. When we assess our students using formative assessment, it's actually feedback to us as teachers about the effectiveness of our instructional practice. And so we'd like for you to be thinking about all of these. And a lot of folks actually said all of the above. Excellent. You guys are exactly on the right track. So, folks, we're going to begin to define feedback here.
Sure. Thank you, Tony. And good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. And Tony's gotten us started thinking about what feedback is. So now let's consider how feedback can give this evidence of learning that we're all looking for in the Common Core era, and in fact, we've always been looking for in terms of student learning. So as we think about how to help students move along this learning continuum, feedback is most effective when it's given in relation to a stated learning intention, such as a Common Core standard, which makes sense. In other words, I need to know, as a student, I need to be able to focus my learning around these three questions. And they're really very fundamental questions. One is, where am I going? And that really is, what is my learning intention? What's the learning goal? What's this piece that I need to get to? What is my learning intention? And then for many students, of course, at this point, it's the Common Core Standard. And then the next big question is, how am I going? How am I going in terms of my learning? How's my learning proceeding? How am I doing on this learning continuum? What am I missing? So in other words, just kind of monitoring where I am in this journey of my learning. And then the last one, where to next? Where is my next step to reach my learning intention? Or if I master this step of learning, where do I go next? So this visual of going down a road is very apropos, because we are on a journey towards a destination, which is our learning objective, our learning intention, the Common Core Standard. But we must consider, how am I going, and then where to next. And feedback is meant to close the gap between where the student is meant to be, which is the where am I going, and where the student currently is in his or her learning. Feedback, as we will be talking about a lot today, closes that gap. And go ahead,
Betty,
Tony.
if I may, just as you're speaking, I'm struck by an observation that I've made as I'm working with in schools and seeing teachers working daily. It seems to me that we're getting better at the first part, at helping students understand what it is they're supposed to do, defining, as you said, those learning intentions. We seem to be getting a little bit better at letting kids know, or helping kids understand where they are in relation to those learning targets. But where I particularly am seeing a breakdown is in that third question that you posed here. What are your observations there?
Well, I think that's very true, and I think these three fundamental questions need to become a part of all of our learning strategies and our overall vision for learning, because it's not just a matter of the first two. And I think you're very correct in terms of Common Core Standards, especially focusing our learning intentions, and even thinking about how am I going. But this where to next, how do I put that next little piece in place that's going to move that learning along? I think that's some new learning for all of us.
And I think you've nailed it there when we're talking about, again, the challenge that we're facing with this transition to Common Core. This is really just a foundational piece, foundational practices as we're looking to really be successful with the Common Core Standards. So, folks, if I may, I'd like to step back for a second and give you a little bit of background on John Hattie's research and why we're talking to you today about feedback. Especially as we consider this transition to the Common Core and that increase in rigor. In order for us to meet that challenge that we face, to close that gap that Betty's describing, we have to absolutely select those instructional and leadership practices that are most effective. Hattie and his colleagues have provided us really with a visual tool to help us picture the impact that our practices have on student achievement. And you see that on the screen in front of you. Hattie describes a gauge or a barometer and uses what's called an effect size to level the playing field so that we can make meaningful comparisons between studies, different studies that use different scoring scales to measure student achievement. So we translate all of that into, or he's translated all of that into an effect size. And so what you see are kind of a synopsis of the findings here. Starting at 0, there are actually some things that we do in schools that have a negative impact on student achievement or a negative effect size. That's that section labeled reverse effects, below 0. We can actually move kids backwards. One of those that just leaps out of the pages in Visible Learning and Visible Learning for Teachers is retention. That actually has an effect size of negative 0.2. From 0 to positive 0.2, that's the growth that we would see just as students mature. They have new experiences. They read more things. They are getting older and having more learning opportunities each and every day. And so that translates to an effect size of up to about 0.2. From 0.2 to 0.4 that you see there circled at the top of the screen, that is the typical teacher effect. So as Hattie synopsized over 800,000 studies in Visible Learning, averaged all of those things together, what he found was that the average teacher in the average school has an effect size up to about 0.4. So if we want to think about this in terms of closing that gap that Betty described, I want you to think, folks, about 0.4 as 1 year's learning. We can translate that to the equivalent of 1 year's learning. So Hattie's challenge to us is that we should pick only those practices that are beyond an effect size of 0.4, the section, the largest section that you see on your screen labeled the zone of desired effects. So selecting only those most powerful practices that have greater than an effect size of greater than 0.4. So, and the challenge that he presents us, folks, is that when our colleagues, and I've said this myself, you know, what I do works. Why should I do something different? Hattie's research supports that. He's found that actually 95% of what teachers do does indeed work. The challenge is that most of that falls into that range of typical teacher effects between 0.2 and 0.4. So if we're going to close this gap, we can't do what we've always done. Because we're going to perpetuate that gap. And so we need to choose those practices that exceed that average of 1 year's growth. And feedback, folks, you see here, as the screen catches up, there we go, has an effect size, average effect size of 0.75. Now, remember, ladies and gentlemen, we said that 0.4 is 1 year's growth. I want you to think about the gap in rigor between our current standards and what we're transitioning to with Common Core. I want you to think about those students who've come into our schools and our classrooms with significant learning deficits. If we're going to close those gaps, if we're going to address those deficits, we literally can't afford to do what we've done. We can't do that 95% of what we've done that works. We have to choose practices that have a really significant impact. So roughly translated, what we're talking about here is that effective feedback, and please note my qualifier, effective feedback, feedback when done well, has an effect size of 0.75, which roughly translates to almost 2 years gain. And I understand from Kathy we have a question.
We do. I have to pull us back a couple of slides, and I apologize, but when we looked at the feedback as evidence about where am I going, how am I going, and where to next, Everett asked the question, what about the question, where am I now?
Absolutely, and Everett, I'll let Betty respond to this as well, but where am I now is very much comes in that second question of how am I going. This is a little bit of a New Zealander kind of phrased question here, as that's where John Hattie is from. But your question is a piece of that second question. Betty, would you care to respond a little bit?
I was going to say another way to look at that second question is how am I doing? How am I doing instead of maybe going? And Tony's right. We have to kind of do a little translating here. But I think your question fits right in that second question.
All right. Everett, thanks for the question. Please, folks, keep them coming. Now, remember I said, ladies and gentlemen, that when feedback is done well, we get an effect size of 0.75. But in order for that to work, our school has to be a place, our system has to be an environment that is a safe place for feedback. And so we're going to ask you if your school currently is a safe place for feedback, and we're going to present another poll. But the reason we're stopping to do this, folks, and that we encourage you to conduct a similar survey on your site, feedback really is dependent on a high degree of relational trust. I have to trust that the person who's giving me the feedback is interested in my gains, interested in my growth, and not just criticizing. And we have another question.
We do. Pat asks, how are you defining feedback?
So, and feedback is a bunch of things, and Betty's question, Betty's discussion earlier about feedback is that information that we get that helps us close the gap between our current level of performance and our learning intentions. And that applies to students, it applies to teachers, it applies to administrators, but it is information that helps us close that gap. And we have another question.
We do. Liz asks about the diagram, just confirming that it equals 2.5 years of learning.
So that would actually, it's right, roughly, it's just under 2 years. So if our effect size is 0.4 is 1 year's average growth, 2 years would be about 0.8. And so, and it depends on where you look at feedback. Some of Dr. Hattie's most recent studies or publications actually have the effect size of feedback as even greater than 0.75, but we're being conservative in putting that 0.75 up there. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, I'd like for you to take a couple of minutes and respond to this poll about the degree of relational trust in your building or district. Give you again about 30 seconds or so to work on that. And we see responses coming in. So far 35% have voted. You all are a terrifically responsive audience. Give another 15 seconds or so. We're at 70% voting. I'm chuckling because the results are kind of making a nice traditional bell curve. As we're coming in, okay, we're roughly 80% voting. Maybe another 5 seconds and we'll switch this poll off and display the results. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, you should be seeing the results displayed on your screen momentarily. And as you can see, the bell curve that I was describing, most of us responded that we're kind of in the medium layer or medium range for relational trust. Now, and
Tony,
ladies and gentlemen,
I was just going to say, I think it's very encouraging that we don't see any percentage at all in the non-existent.
absolutely right. That would be a scary place to work.
That would be, yes.
And for feedback to be effective, we do have to have a very high degree of relational trust. And so Betty's right. While the results are encouraging, we've also got to take some very deliberate steps to improve those responses. We'd love to see everybody responding to polls like these. So here's the definition of relational trust. As cited by John Hattie, it's literally the glue that holds the relationships in a class or school or staff together. So as I said earlier, it's that degree to which I trust that the person sitting across the table from me or watching me in my classroom is really there in my best interests and not to catch me doing something wrong. When I have that sense, when I believe that, I'm far more likely to accept any of that feedback and use it for what it is. I remember one time as a presenter, I actually got some absolutely horrible feedback on an evaluation form, and frankly, it was devastating, absolutely devastating. And normal human response, I think, at least I hope I'm normal. I got mad about it, and I was speaking to a colleague of mine at the center, and he had actually done a session with us that day and was talking about how to use feedback. And at the end of his session, I said, well, fine, what do you do with negative feedback? And he said, Tony, you need to stop right there. And I'm still kind of mad. I said, well, what's the problem? He said, there's your first problem. I said, what do you mean? He said, you're calling it negative feedback. I said, well, yeah, it was negative. Look at what she wrote on this form. And he said, well, it's feedback. It's information to tell you how you did in your job. In this case, I didn't have a degree of trust with this participant. I really didn't know her. I didn't know where she was coming from. And so I was very defensive in my response to that feedback. And it takes time to develop it, but it is something that you have to pay attention to. Do I have questions, Kathy?
We do from
All right.
Stephen. He says, how does the use of data to evaluate staff and the move to non-evaluation-based RIF impact trust?
Boy, I tell you, that's a great question, and I'll let Betty respond as well in just a second. But it has to, just as with good assessment practice for students, there's multiple opportunities for success. If we're going to use data to evaluate our teachers and our administrators, we have to provide them multiple opportunities to be successful, provide them with the feedback that helps them improve their performance, and an opportunity and time to make changes in their actions such that they can reach our intentions or our goals. Betty, your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that it has to be a very open process in terms of the data and in terms of the purpose for which it's going to be used. And I think if we keep our eye always on what is this doing for students, how can we improve student learning, I think that has to be the overarching umbrella. And then if we have that overarching umbrella, then within that, or under that umbrella, I should say, we can start to move forward. How does my contribution advance student learning? And I think if we take it off the person and onto how can we get better, how can we advance the student learning, then I think that for me is a big piece, this open thinking and open communication with a focus on students, always about students.
Thanks for the questions, folks. Keep them rolling in. We greatly appreciate the interactivity. Question a while earlier was about our definition of feedback, and you see that now on your screen. So we'll kind of as an formative assessment for me, see how we did, and let Betty define feedback for you.
Right. Well, of course, Tony was talking about the culture of receiving and giving feedback, and actually that was what that last question was about also, in a sense, was giving feedback to teachers. But one of the definitions, a big piece of the definition, is that feedback is just in time, just for me. I'm going to repeat that again. Just in time, just for me. So if you think about yourself as a learner, maybe learning about, I'm privileged to work with teachers a great deal on Common Core, and if you think about teachers learning, or you're learning about, say, text complexity in the ELA and Literacy Common Core standards, what if you didn't understand something and someone stepped in just in time the moment you were struggling and gave you just that little bit of connection? I've seen it happen as I've worked with teachers. They'll go, oh, yeah, now I understand. Oh, that's the light bulb. Oh, that's that just in time, just for me kind of feedback. And I'd like to kind of unfortunately make a confession this morning, which is to say that I know as a teacher I didn't always get my written feedback back to students as maybe as quickly as I should. I know it was personalized, but you know how life happens. But what I realize now is that a student's next piece of learning might have been delayed because of my delay. My feedback wasn't just in time. So we have to think about the opportunities we have as teachers as we're moving about the classroom, as we're doing that formative assessment that Tony referred to. Where is my opportunity to give that just in time and just for me feedback? And when Tony's mentioned that the Common Core standards are rigorous and challenging, which they are, but what we know is the greater the challenge, the higher the probability that a student needs feedback. So it's essential, just essential, that the teacher is there to provide that. And I was going to just piggyback on what Tony said about the hidden life of learners, and that 80% of the feedback a student receives each day is from other students, and 80% is wrong. We need to be there just in time to hopefully be the one that gives the feedback and not the other students. So
you mentioned a short company. Sorry to jump in there, but I was chuckling as you were talking because I was thinking about the stack of papers that used to sit on the corner of my desk in my classroom, and you know, as we look at this just-in-time piece of feedback, one of the things that we know about effective feedback is that it needs to come within 72 hours of the performance if it's going to make a difference. And I'm glad to hear I'm not the only teacher that had a stack of papers on the side of the desk. And it also reminds me, you know, folks, regardless of what you think about Walmart as a quality place to shop, but Walmart became Walmart because they have this concept of just-in-time delivery. When you buy something off the shelf there, the computer at Walmart is ordering another one of those so that the shelves are very seldom empty. Now think about that in terms of students learning, providing, as Betty's described, that next piece of knowledge such that kids just in time are ready to take that next step. And that's what we need to do. And I understand from Kathy we have a question at this point.
We do from Chasen. From a school leader's perspective, how do you balance the principle of just for me with trying to move teachers towards school-wide priorities?
Betty, you want to start there?
Well, I'll start there with focus, I think, Jason. In terms of that, yes, you certainly have all the other considerations as a school leader, but I think that what we know is that sometimes we have too many standards, too many initiatives, too many things going on in our schools. So I think if focus is part of it, and then if you're also talking about, say, teacher evaluation or teacher professional development there, that it's a focused kind of delivery, and so that everything that you're doing is concentrating on improving student achievement, but within a certain focus.
And I'd like to piggyback on Betty there and say, you know, that focus is important. And a lot of times we're faced as school or district leaders and trying to think about providing professional development and coaching to our teachers based on where each and every teacher is. Well, the challenge is that doing that really defeats the focus that Betty's describing. And so the balance point for you, Jason, is it is okay as a school or a district leader to establish certain key practices on which we all need to get better. For example, the provision of feedback. And where the just for me comes into play is in defining where I as teacher am in relation to this focused practice that we as a school are working on. So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of professional development, but there is a central focus, as Betty has stressed, to that professional development, to our coaching and observation and feedback, such that we can get better collectively at that practice. So again, central focus, but the just for me is where I am as a teacher in relation to that. All right.
Well, we've talked about the just-in-time, just-in-me, and we've talked about some notion along with what is feedback. So I think it's time for our next poll, and I'd like to ask you to be considering, I know that there's a next poll coming here. There it is. Which feedback statement at this point do you think is most effective in advancing student learning? Would you take about 30 seconds, please, to respond to that poll? Which feedback statement most effective in advancing student learning?
All right, and the folks, the results will be displayed on your screen momentarily.
Look at that, what fast learners we have here. Exactly. Some of you have said A, and we're going to talk about that type of feedback in just a few minutes when we talk about the 4 levels of feedback. On B, obviously, you notice that was way, way, way too general. And then we've got a little bit more specific on C, but there you are, 3/4 of you basically talking about identify the strategy you used on the incorrect problem, which of course is getting at that just for me kind of feedback, because I'm the one who evidently did some kind of strategy that was incorrect to lead to an incorrect answer on my problem. Well, all right, well, let's keep moving along then with that. But what we have seen from that poll is that not all feedback statements are equal in advanced learning, and Tony's mentioned that too. So John Hattie and his colleague Helen Temperley designed a structure for giving effective and specific feedback based on 4 levels of feedback. And this is, as you can see on your screen, there's feedback about the task, there's feedback targeted for processing the task, the strategies one uses, feedback for self-regulation strategies, and the student as a person. Now, these 4 levels, each of these levels requires deliberate practice, and there is a logical progression between the levels as you see in this clockwise way. When a teacher knows which level to use and when to use it, learning can be significantly advanced. And of course, Tony almost began our seminar today talking about that 0.75 effect. But he also qualified it by saying effective feedback. And this is where we're going to start to see what is effective feedback, how can we advance that learning even more, because, again, not all feedback is created equal. So, Tony, would you explain about the task level for us, please?
All right. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to reiterate a statement that Betty made there for you, and I'd ask you to jot it down in your notes and find it again in the recording. Betty said, knowing when to use what. And so these levels of feedback that you see here, I want you to be thinking throughout our conversation, our dialogue on these levels of feedback, that this is a progression, a very deliberate progression through these level of feedback, these different levels of feedback. So we want to start at the task level, and at this level, this is specific feedback about how well the student is performing the individual task that we've asked them to accomplish or to complete. So it's information about that level of performance on the task itself. We might ask questions along the lines of, is your answer right or wrong? What would the correct answer be here? An example would be a 4th grade Common Core State Standard that asks students to fluently add and subtract multi-digit whole numbers using the standard algorithm. Feedback at this task level would help students understand whether their answer is right or wrong in applying that algorithm. Typically, students at this level, when we're concentrating on task feedback, is as students are novice in whatever the task is. It's new to them. They're trying to develop the skills and knowledge, and so we're concentrating on providing that feedback. And folks, this deliberate progression, I can't stress this enough because I think back on my own practice in the classroom. I'm sure many of us here today, well, I'm hoping I'm not the only teacher that feels they'd really like to go back to their first couple of classes and apologize and say, if I knew the things then that I know now, boy, would that have been different. But I'm thinking about how I used to provide feedback, and I would give my students feedback on all of these levels at once. So deliberate progression based on the student. This is also where the just for me comes in, because I could have some students in my room for whom task feedback is appropriate. That's where they are. Other students who are beginning to master that task or become proficient at that task, and for whom it would be appropriate to move on to feedback at the process level. So here we're moving beyond what it is we've asked the kids to do, the specific criteria that we've asked, and starting to concentrate on the processes that our students use in order to accomplish that task. And I understand from Kathy we have a question?
We do, from Carol. It goes back a little to the definition. And Carol says it makes so much sense, but what advice do you have for teachers who have a very wide range of students, i.e. skill levels, prior knowledge, home language, etc.? If the goal is just for me, how does the teacher reach everyone individually every time feedback is given?
Great question, and I think that's a challenge that many of your colleagues share across the country, and you're speaking to them with that, and certainly want to hear Betty's response on this. But what comes to mind first is the fact that we are often trying to do too many things and trying to accomplish too many standards. And so one of the things that we found at the center in 15-plus years of working with schools and school districts across the country is that they prioritize their standards. They're very deliberate in determining which standards are most important to student success and concentrating our assessment practices, our feedback practices on those students, on those standards for those students. It makes the task more manageable. Betty, your thoughts?
Well, I don't know, Carol, if you have noticed the spiral effect in the, I'm going to use the Common Core as an example here, but if you look at a standard in the Common Core as it spirals up and progresses up in terms of the anchor standard at the top, there are places along the way that are learning progressions for each student. So how do you do that? Well, let's just say we're all working on the same particular anchor standard, the standard that we have in our particular class, et cetera. Students are on varying continuums along that. And I think coming off of what Tony says, if I'm focused, then theoretically, and I know this is difficult, I understand that very well, but if we're all progressing towards a common goal, everybody's moving on towards that goal somewhere along that continuum. And I can provide feedback based on the learning intention, and then the standard it may be, to where that student is at that time. And maybe it's just a little piece that he or she needs to move up that learning continuum. Maybe it's a larger piece. Maybe that student is actually ready to accelerate into another grade level standard. But I think the focus that Tony talked about is the crucial part, so that I'm not trying to give feedback on all kinds of different standards or learning intentions all over the room at one point. I think the focus on what's going on is most important.
And Betty, I think we've hit a point here that resonates with folks. I understand from Kathy we've got some more questions pertaining to that.
We do, and Chuck says or asks, if formative assessment indicates multiple students are deficient in a skill, would feedback that wasn't just for me be acceptable?
Oh, certainly we can reflect on some of this information as a class as a whole, but it's important to remember that, with attention cycles and where students are in the learning, a lot of times when we do say, look, most of you guys missed this question, we'll have kids who have tuned out. They're thinking about something else, or who hear that and go, well, that doesn't apply to me, even though they've missed that question. So it certainly can be a portion of our feedback, but it's important that students have the opportunity to personalize that and see where that applies to them. Betty, your thoughts?
Well, of course, we talk a lot about differentiation and meeting the needs of all students, and I'm thinking that obviously in some cases one is going to give feedback to an entire class, but we have a real opportunity to at least get small groups of students and provide feedback, some just for me feedback within that particular setting, and then get even more specific with the individual students.
Excellent. Kathy?
And there's another question from Karen. Are there so many Common Core standards that we are going to be overwhelmed again with too much to cover?
Could
Yes,
I address that?
Go for it, Betty.
Well, you know what we know about the Common Core standards is that they are fewer, clearer, and higher. They are fewer. Many states have, I mean, oh my goodness, hundreds almost. You look at this. When you look at the Common Core standards, they are definitely fewer, and it allows more focus and allows more focus instructional practice, leadership practices, professional development, et cetera. So in my opinion, as coming from my classroom background and school background and district background, I welcome them for a multitude of reasons, but I welcome them because I think they are fewer.
And I would second that. While I strongly feel that they represent an improvement over what most of us had, I think there's still, Karen, in response to your question, there is still a lot there. I would encourage you to check out some of Larry Ainsworth's writings on this, where he's gone through in his work on rigorous curriculum design and common formative assessments and done a comparison of the number of average state standards versus average Common Core standards. And one that just kind of stands out in memory for me is that in the middle school spans, grades 6 through 8, there are still, I think it's about 160 different standards for middle school mathematics, which is an improvement over 250, but still a lot. And so we still find districts around the country that find a need to, even given the greater clarity, even given the reduction in number, find it necessary to prioritize the standards. All right, so transitioning back to feedback at the process level, again, folks, I want to reiterate, this is for students who've begun to master the task. They're starting to become proficient at that task. And so at this level, we're focusing on what processes the students themselves are using to go about accomplishing the task that we've set for them. And so a teacher might ask questions along the lines of, what went wrong as you did this work and why? What strategies did you use, and how did they help you solve this? What changes might we need to make, or you need to make in that strategy next time, or how could you generalize that strategy? As kids begin to become metacognitive or more aware of their thinking, we can then transition them to feedback at the self-regulation level.
Right, and at this level, and I do appreciate the word metacognitive because there's so many metacognitive skills necessary for Common Core, a student is really consciously thinking about the way in which he or she is monitoring, directing, regulating actions towards the learning goal. So if we use that Common Core math example again, the student would be thinking about, what do I do if I get stuck? Do I go back and begin again? Do I dig into one part of the process? What do I do? Now, Tony has mentioned that there is a progression here. So this is for a student who has that high degree of proficiency, who knows the task, and then needs feedback at the self-regulation level. And those prompts might be, how can you monitor your own work? How can you self-check? The student's ready for this now at this particular point. And then if we look at our last level, our fourth level of feedback, this is called self-level. Now this is commonly subsumed under the notion of praise, and praise is often used to comfort and support, and it's present in every classroom. I know I used it definitely, and it's welcomed by students, and you know, we as adults, we actually like our praise also. But here's the problem. Sometimes it will direct attention away from the three levels we just talked about, away from task, away from processes, or self-regulation, and it usually contains little task-related information. It doesn't help a student with the questions of where am I going, or how am I going, or where to next. So an example, again, of our fourth grade math example, if we gave feedback at the self level, we'd be saying something like, you're such a good student to try so hard when you do the problem. Well, it doesn't give any information about learning. So praise can be used, of course, but not in a way that dilutes the learning. And the bottom line is we need to keep praise separate from feedback about the learning, separate from the feedback about the learning.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, our time is swiftly drawing to a close here. And so I'd like to offer a couple of thoughts as we wrap up our content, and certainly Betty and I will stay on the line to respond to questions as they continue to come in. But as you're thinking about what we've talked about today and how to apply those in your school or district, I'd like to offer 4 steps for you here. Next steps to move forward in this work. First thing that is necessary to be done is that you assess the current level or degree of relational trust in your building or your district. And John Hattie offers a survey, an actual online survey to help you tabulate that data. If you're interested in finding out more about that, please just contact us and we'll get you in touch with those folks. Certainly you could do your own assessment of the degree of relational trust in your building. Once you have that assessment in hand, we have to respond to it. We have to begin to take deliberate steps to improve relational trust in our buildings. And there's a variety of ways that we go about doing that, from conversations with folks to being present to letting folks know that we're seeing both the effective things that they're doing as well as some areas for improvement. So first step, assess. Second step, respond. Now that being said, folks, this is a lot like buy-in. We can't wait to build the relational trust before we begin to work on feedback, because there is so much involved here. There's so much that we need to get done. So at the same time, we also need to assess the current knowledge of our teachers and administrators as to what is good feedback. How do we go about providing meaningful feedback? And then 4th step, respond to what we find there with professional development, coaching, and support. And again, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to find out more about these practices, we know that a 45-minute webinar is insufficient to address all of your questions. There are several options here that you might pursue. Again, Visible Learning Foundation Seminar in Las Vegas on December 4th and 5th. There is a Visible Learning Institute in Phoenix, Arizona on December 14th with John Hattie himself, as well as our colleague Raymond Smith. Certainly check out the permanent resources of Visible Learning or Visible Learning for Teachers. And then the Data Team Summit, if you'd like to find out more about effective teacher collaboration around data, effective administrator collaboration around data, the Data Team Summit is for you. Please send in other questions that you have for us, or future topics you'd like to see on the webinar using the question function on your screen. And do not hesitate, ladies and gentlemen, to contact either of us with your questions. I would like to say thank you for your attention today, and then give my colleague Betty an opportunity to close out.
And also, yes, I just want to add, before Betty closes out, that we do have some additional questions, and Tony and Betty will respond to those each personally. So if you all, we do have your email addresses when you registered, and we will make sure that the responses, the questions that you asked are in fact answered. Okay, Betty, back to you. Thank you.
Sure, and I just want to thank everybody again, because regardless of whether a teacher, school leader, administrator, whatever your role and responsibility in working and helping our students, you've had to take time away from that, and I appreciate your spending that time with Tony and me today.
All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a great rest of your day.